80 years ago, over 100 million people were killed and wounded in the World Anti-Fascist War. In the summer of 1945, 50 countries came together in San Francisco and agreed on an international treaty known as the UN Charter, which paved the way for the establishment of the UN later that year. This formed the political basis of a new international order, an order intended to enshrine the equal rights of all people and maintain peace. How has this order shaped the world we live in today? How are the ambitious goals faring today, and what may be undermining this order, which was so hard won? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Lund, Sweden, by Jan Ahlberg, co-founder of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research; from Taipei, Taiwan Province, by Professor Liu Fu Kuo, research fellow at the Institute of International Relations at the National Cheng Chi University; from Manila, the Philippines, by Romel Banlaoi, president of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies; from Shanghai, by Joseph Mahoney, professor at East China Normal University; and last but not least, from Beijing, by Zhao Hai, director of the International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy. Gentlemen, welcome to this special program. First of all, let's refresh our memory of the Second World War before we talk about the post-World War order. Exactly what black hole has to be filled before we talk about the post-war order. Jan, let me go to you here. From a Western perspective, we often mention the European theater as if that is the only place where fierce battles took place. Actually, in my history book, I also learned about the beginning of the Second World War being what happened in 1939 by Nazi Germany in Poland. So what brush-ups do we need before we talk about the post-World War order?
Well, on this issue, thank you for having me. We need to talk about the global perspective instead of a Western narrative only. But of course, the West and other countries are feeding on their own narratives. But what we focused on mainly in the West, as everybody knows, is the 6 million Jews, and you are now mentioning 100 million people who died. And we need to have a completely different history writing, which is global and not regional or national history. Secondly, the whole thing has been, even if you take the time right after the 45, when the Cold War started, that has always had two branches. One in the West between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, Soviet Union and the West, Marxism and liberal democracy, whatever. On the one hand, the true Western brothers, because they're both Western countries, basically. And then the difference between the West and Asia, Africa. And I think that is high time the Westerners acquaint themselves with the important aspects that you're bringing up in this program. There is a global history and not just a parochial, self-serving narrative of what happened. And that leads straight into today's falling apart of the Western Empire, if you ask me.
Joseph, let me go to Joseph Mahoney, professor at East China Normal University. Do you think it is also important to look at the Second World War from a global perspective instead of a European perspective alone, in order for us to understand what emerged from the end of this war, which is a post-war international order? What is exactly that order, and why does it matter so much?
I think part of the problem is that we see the international order in facing some existential crises today, and the world itself facing a number of existential crises. And a lot of these have their roots in some of the unresolved issues that were sort of swept under the rug with the end of World War II, which, I think one of the things that we have to point out here is that certainly in the case of Japan, we had the United States that accommodated covering up a lot of what Japan had done, shifting all the blame to certain military leaders, not holding the political leaders responsible, even keeping them in power. because the United States wanted to quickly pacify Japan so it could pivot to Asia, pivot to fighting socialism and communism then rising on the Korean Peninsula, and certainly coming in from the Soviet Union and the development of the CPC in China. So this is part of the history. So the U.S. does not force Japan to come to terms with its dark history the way Germany was comparably in Europe, but instead helps cover that up, and then finds itself fighting the Chinese on the Korean Peninsula as well as the Koreans, and then playing all sorts of games in the Cold War period that follows. So this is where we get into problems like issues not resolved with islands being returned properly, like the Daewoo, or contested spaces over the Spratlys, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, you're mentioning some of the very important points of contention that are flaring up from time to time in the South China Sea, for instance, or over the island of Taiwan. Some of the most important documents, legal documents that led to Japanese surrender, unconditional surrender at the end of World War II were Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Declaration, which had specific provisions about Japan saying all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese shall be restored to China. That was written in Cairo Declaration in December 1943. It was attended by China, the United States, and the UK. And then in July 1945, the three countries met again in Potsdam, Germany, and made a Potsdam Proclamation, which was later recognized by the former Soviet Union. And the proclamation explicitly declares in Article 8 that the terms of the Cairo Declaration shall be carried out. Again, this is an international legal document that's uncontested. Zhao Hai, let me go to you here. How important are these two legal treaties in terms of leading up to or establishing or paving the way for a political order as the world emerges from the Second World War?
Well, first of all, let me make this very clear that these two documents are the foundational documents during the war. That is very basic, lead to how to resolve, how to lead to the end of the war, and how to dismember the Japanese empire and restore peace and order to this world. So these principles are laid down during that time. Actually, at that time, those countries are still at war with Japan. So these two documents said how Japanese should surrender, and after the surrendering, what the Japanese should do. So these things are actually followed strictly right after the war. However, it's been disrupted, as we mentioned before, by the change of American foreign policy because of the Cold War. However, I think the principle continues until today because, as you also mentioned, that these two declarations are never contested. The surrendered Japanese state still recognize those documents, and these documents are recognized, acknowledged by the world. So I think by that principle, today, if we go against those documents or disrupt and bring down the post-World War II international order, then I think it's not only open the door for one or two single issues, but reopen the entire global system to the risk of more destability, destabilizing the entire system.
Well, some people would say, look, these seem to be regional issues, right? It talks about what Japan stole from China and what are to be done to these territories. Rather, they seem local. How does that constitute a threat to, or the negating of these legal documents? How does that constitute a threat to the global system? As a lot of people would say, the global order or the international order that was established after World War II was centered on the United Nations, which, as I mentioned earlier, the Charter of the United Nations was reached only in 1945, in the summer of 1945.
first of all, there's a prolonged discussion about how to reestablish order after World War II, because after World War I, we know there's established of League of Nations, there's an entire system that's been built up. However, that system collapsed after 1931, and then later on after the 1939. So after the World War II, I mean, during this time, a lot of people are thinking, how do we build a system that can be long-lasting and and sustainable? And I think that's why the establishment of United Nations is so important, because at this time they revised and improved upon the League of Nations and set up the UN Security Council. And that is a very important concept. Until today, the UN Security Council permanent members and other members organizing into the group make sure that all global important security issues are going through that council and being resolved and forming a internationally unified opinion on a certain issue. So that is very important to maintain post-war global peace and stability. So today, it's very important to remember that and reflect upon how, if we don't respect and continue to support that international organization, what we would face in the future.
Professor Liu Fukuo in Taiwan, what is your take as to the importance of the resolution of the status of Taiwan? For instance, Taiwan was called Formosa as a legacy of colonial era. The importance of honoring the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, which restore Formosa or Taiwan as a piece of territory stolen by Japan to China. How important is that to the post-war international order?
I agree. These two, Potsdam and Cairo Declaration, mainly set a clear guideline for the next step negotiation, especially between Japan and also Western country, Japan and China. And I want to pinpoint to this specific treaty signed in 1952, Sino-Japanese Peace Treaty, negotiated in Taipei, signed in Taipei almost 8 months after San Francisco Peace Treaty. And interestingly, as we discuss and recognize on the Article 2 of Sino-Japan's Peace Treaty, in which connected with San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan has renounced all right, title, and claims to Taiwan.
Sorry for interrupting here. Yes, a point I mentioned already, the San Francisco Peace Treaty is not recognized because there is no Chinese representative to this treaty. Why do you think it is still relevant? Is it still relevant in terms of resolving the post-war issues regarding Japan and China?
Because San Francisco Peace Treaty was the only one right after the end of the World War II. In between Western country and Japan, it is not complete because in which discussion the peace treaty did not really touch upon the clear guideline of these territorial transfers between Japan back to China. And I think one of you mentioned earlier, 钓鱼台 or 钓鱼 Island, and also South China Sea altogether. And I want to pinpoint this two connection because almost right after San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japanese government and Republic of China government negotiated as clearly give this article, and I especially mentioned Taiwan, Penghu, and also Spratly Island and the Paracel Island to be Japanese government renounced to China, for instance. But of course, in the Western official document, British government did not consider through this bilateral negotiation, the territory have been transferred, and even American officials also consider by these two bilateral treaty does not directly reflect and also set a standard of Taiwan status. But I have to say, legally, this is something connecting with San Francisco Peace Treaty. And I agree, because China did not really participate in this important negotiation. So it has left some room for further discussion. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the war order was dominated by American power from them. And much part of this design, actually, gradually we can recognize through American power politics, they decide which way to go. So this may not be fair for many Asian countries to recognize that's yes.
Okay. Mr. Zhao Hai, do you have some different points to make here? If you do, you are welcome to jump in here in terms of, it's a very complicated piece of history, I would understand. Sometimes the San Francisco Peace Treaty alone is referred to as the legal document by which China and Japan or other countries resolve their territorial disputes, but China officially does not recognize this, and we always return to the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation. Do you have some points to add here that may help us understand the situation more clearer?
Well, I think previously Professor Mahoney has mentioned this. At that time, I think the United States is busy dealing with the Korean War and also the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and also overall globally, they're in this Cold War with the Soviet Union. So back then, San Francisco Treaty is very much a peace treaty that's between Japan and the United States, try to resolve the problems between those two powers, so that the United States can focus on dealing with the rising communism, so-called, at that time. So that's why China was not part of that the conference, and also not signing those treaties. Of course, some principles of the treaty that's in line with the Cairo Declaration we can recognize, but the entirety of the treaty is not part that we recognize. But again, I think after that, over the years, China and Japan has been trying to resolve the problems by themselves. And over the years, there's historical and also political documents stated that the Japanese recognize their historical crimes against Chinese people, the military aggression against China, and also apologized, but not necessarily enough, for their historical crime. Until today, so for instance, the Nanjing massacre, there's a lot of atrocities committed on the Chinese mainland, also including Taiwan. So moving forward, I think it's very important not only that China and Japan continue to talk about the history and to reflect upon the history, but also very important for Japan to recognize the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity, to recognize what happened after World War II, and to recognize that legal status of the land, including Taiwan and South China Sea, be part of China's sovereignty and territory.
Thank you very much for those important information. Mr. Zhao, you mentioned the South China Sea. Actually, South China Sea is included in the Cairo Declaration as part of the territories that Japan has stolen from the Chinese, and it shall be restored to China together with the island of Taiwan. Rommel, let me go to you here. If this Cairo Declaration was observed and implemented to the letter and to the spirit, there shouldn't really be the disputes surrounding the South China Sea, especially what we're seeing now. What has happened that got the water very muddy over the past few decades?
Well, I would like to point out that while countries are redefining their national territories after the Second World War, we should be reminded the post-World War II international order calls for the need for international cooperation in order to maintain international peace and security. So despite all these conflicting claims over territories, we should not lose sight of the fact that the World War II international order is urging all countries in the world to pursue international cooperation in order to maintain international peace and security. And I think that is the kind of principle that we need to uphold in the South China Sea. That while we are competing for national claims, we are competing for territories. Even the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea is calling all parties involved in territorial conflicts and even maritime jurisdictional disputes to pursue cooperation of pragmatic nature. And I think that is the directions that we need to take, that despite all these national claims over territories and maritime jurisdictions, that we still need to pursue the need for international cooperation in order to maintain international peace and security. And we have to focus our attention on that we need to focus on international cooperation, because that's the spirit of the Second World War II international order,
Yeah.
that is pursuing international cooperation to pursue peace.
Is the international order that has been formed at such a big, high cost, 100 million people dead or wounded for years, have we learned the lesson, or maybe 80 years is a bit too long? Yan, let me go back to you. Is it fading in people's memory, and that's why things are, some ugly things are rearing its head again over the past few years?
Well, I used to say when it comes to international security and peace work and all that, first of all, the Western world particularly is peace illiterate and going militarist. And secondly, it seems that the only thing we can learn from history, is that we don't learn from history. We are very close to something very nasty in the Western world because of the insistence of the West dominating the rest. So you can say the United States hijacked the world in 1945, and they did it again at the end of the Cold War. And this will not be possible for the third time. So I think that all the things we've been talking about kind of comes together in the crisis of the United Nations now. Now, the United Nations is in a liquidity crisis. You know why? Because the world's countries, the members of the UN, spend 100 times more on weapons and war than they do on everything the United Nations does. Now, if these are the priorities of the world, we can forget about the future. There is no way we can make a cooperative, wonderful world according to the Charter of the UN if we don't change those priorities. And secondly, who were absent from the meeting in the White House?
Guterres.
The UN Secretary General.
Yeah,
How
why
can we
was
make
he?
peace in Ukraine ignoring completely the peacekeeping experience and competence of the United Nations? Now, NATO think it can do it. It cannot do peacekeeping. It's very sad. It's sad. We must talk about the UN. Its 80th anniversary coming up.
Exactly. Joseph, did it look strange to you that at this moment the United Nations is so marginalized? It's at a near limbo collapse, in terms of coming into decisions that are meaningful. What has happened, really? And does that mean that the international order, again a big question, the international order that emerged after the Second World War is de facto defunct?
Well, I think that there are strong arguments that the system remains resilient. Certainly, a lot of the institutions are still in place and they're still functioning, but they clearly are suffering tremendously. There are arguments that they are in decline or nearing a state of collapse. More optimistically, we might say that we're in a period of transition or evolution. Certainly, the world system needs tremendous reforms. And I think that, we see some countries really trying to be proactive in that. But at the same time, we see countries like the United States doing what they can to undermine, to quit, to abdicate, to cut off funding. to not join or recognize treaties in the first place. So yes, the international system is in a state of crisis, and we do have a number of mounting, intersecting crises, even of the sort that we sometimes describe as singularities, whether it's paradigm shifting technologies or novel disease outbreaks or global climate change. So we're clearly in this sort of existential moment, and that moment is reflected in the status of the international system itself. But I would like to go back to a moment to something that I think we neglected to mention in the earlier discussion, and that is, I think in the Western imagination, the Chinese concept of the 9-dash line is something that the Westerners believe that China just created out of whole cloth, out of some imaginary historical document. In the last few years, it's important to remember that the 9-dash line was introduced in 1947. That this was following in the wake of the Cairo Declaration in 43 and the Potsdam Declaration in 45. China was already, accounting for the things that it had lost and the things that it aimed to recover. And of course, later in 1982, we have a different system that's put in place, keeping in mind that China was excluded from the 51 treaty, and China did not recognize the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, because that set up this standard of coastal states being able to claim up to 200 nautical miles from their shores, which runs directly contrary to China's 9-dash line claims. So we have this fundamental conflict in the system, and we have a fundamental conflict over the status of Taiwan. On the one hand, the UN has been rather clear, I think, that Taiwan is a province of China, and yet we have people in the West trying to exploit this and say no, that this wasn't really resolved, and have continued to not only create provocations related to Taiwan, but also the Diaoyu and in the South China Sea, because these are precisely the points where the West, or the U.S. in particular, wants to pressure China with so-called freedom of navigation patrols.
Yeah, we have to wrap it there. Unfortunately, time has run out. I would have wanted to give people more time to chip in on this very important discussion. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests from around the world: Jan Alberg in Sweden, Professor Liu Fukuo from Taiwan Province, Romel Banlaoi from the Philippines, Zhao Hai in Beijing, and Joseph Mahoney in Shanghai. Thank you so much for your insights. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing on behalf of the whole team. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point.